At my grandson Ethan's 18th birthday dinner, his mother, my daughter-in-law Brenda, introduced me to everyone as the shrew who ruined our family. My son David barely protested. I simply held her gaze, a quiet fire burning within. But when it came time for presents, Ethan insisted on opening my humble gift first, a box holding our real family story. This is just the beginning. Like, share, and let me know where you were listening from. Eleanor clutched the small rectangular package wrapped in faded newspaper comics, her knuckles white. On the porch of her son's grand house, she smoothed the modest floral dress she'd chosen with care, her heart a tangled knot of excitement and apprehension. Today was Ethan's 18th birthday, a milestone she wouldn't miss for anything. It had been 3 long months since she'd last seen him, a gap enforced by the silent, unyielding wall her daughter-in-law, Brenda, habitually built between them. A hopeful tremor ran through Eleanor. Perhaps today, on this significant day, things might be different. The door swung open, revealing Brenda, her smile a thin, brittle line that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Eleanor," she said, her voice cool and perfectly modulated, "you're early." The clock on the wall inside showed it was precisely the time Eleanor had been told to arrive. The subtle jab was as familiar and unwelcome as the chill in the autumn air. Eleanor offered a polite greeting, stepping into a house transformed. Streamers cascaded from every beam, balloons in elegant silver and navy clustered in corners, and a vast banner proclaimed, "Happy 18th birthday, Ethan." The sheer opulence of the decorations was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the quiet, comfortable home Eleanor kept. She felt like an alien visitor, suddenly aware of the worn fabric of her own dress against the silken drapes, the faint scent of lavender from her purse battling the pervasive aroma of expensive catering. She navigated the crowded entryway to a side table groaning under the weight of an absurd number of gifts. Shiny bags with designer logos, elaborately wrapped boxes tied with satin ribbons, all dwarfed her humble offering. With a quiet sigh, Eleanor carefully placed her small, comic-wrapped package amidst the splendor. It contained not just a gift, but a piece of their family's past, something she hoped Ethan would cherish more than any fleeting trend. Seeing Brenda bustling about, directing a harried caterer, Eleanor felt a familiar urge to be useful, to bridge the unspoken chasm. "Brenda, can I help with anything?" she offered, stepping forward. Brenda paused, turning slowly, her gaze sweeping over Eleanor from head to toe before landing on her earnest face. "No, Eleanor, we have everything under control," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Perhaps you could just find a seat in the living room." The dismissal was curt, unequivocal. Eleanor retreated, the familiar sting of unwelcome pushing her further into the shadows. As guests began to arrive, a parade of impeccably dressed friends and distant relatives, Eleanor found herself standing awkwardly in a corner of the living room. Laughter and effusive greetings filled the air, but they bypassed her entirely. She observed, a quiet sentinel, as Brenda moved through the crowd, radiating charm and effortless hospitality to everyone but her. Then, through the throng, Eleanor saw him. Ethan. He stood a head taller than she remembered, his shoulders broader, a nascent stubble hinting at the man he was becoming. His smile, though directed at a school friend, was still the one that melted her heart. A pang of love, sharp and pure, pierced through the layers of resentment and neglect. Despite Brenda's best efforts to keep them apart, the bond with her grandson remained a vibrant, unbreakable thread. Brenda, ever vigilant, seemed to spot Eleanor drifting towards Ethan. She intercepted her with a hand on her arm, her touch cool. "Let's all sit down for dinner, everyone," Brenda announced, her voice carrying across the room. She then steered Eleanor with a firm, almost imperceptible pressure, not towards David or Ethan, but to a solitary seat at the very end of the long, elaborately decorated dining table, nestled between a potted fern and a distant cousin Eleanor barely recognized. Dinner began with Brenda's grand introductions. She moved around the table with theatrical flair, introducing each guest with a charming anecdote, a personal touch, or a flattering remark. "And this is Aunt Carol, my mother's dearest sister, who flew all the way from Arizona," she'd gush. "And here's Dr. Jenkins, Ethan's brilliant physics professor from the university." Each introduction was a performance, a testament to Brenda's impeccable social network. Finally, her gaze settled on Eleanor. She paused, the silence stretching taut and uncomfortable, drawing every eye to Eleanor at the far end of the table. "And this," Brenda declared, her voice dropping to a dramatic whisper that nonetheless carried clearly across the room, "is Eleanor, the shrew who ruined our family." The words hung in the air, sharp and poisonous, slicing through the polite chatter. The room fell silent, a collective gasp echoing unspoken. Eleanor felt a hot flush creep up her neck, her cheeks burning as if slapped. Every eye was on her, a mixture of shock, pity, and uncomfortable curiosity. She met Brenda's triumphant stare, her own gaze unwavering, refusing to drop. David, sitting opposite, stirred uncomfortably. "Mom," he began, his voice barely a whisper, a weak protest against the cruelty. Brenda merely waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, David, it's just a joke. Don't be so sensitive. Everyone knows my sense of humor," she said, forcing a brittle laugh that no one joined. The tension remained thick and suffocating. Dinner continued, but the earlier lightheartedness had vanished. The conversation was stilted, polite, but no one quite looked at Eleanor directly. She barely touched the exquisite food on her plate, her stomach churning with a mixture of shame and a deeper, profound ache for Ethan. What must he be feeling, witnessing his mother's open cruelty toward his grandmother on his own birthday? When the time came for presents, Eleanor braced herself for more awkwardness. But then Ethan, his face alight with anticipation, stood up from his seat at the head of the table. "Okay, presents. I want to open Grandma's first," he declared, his eyes seeking Eleanor out, a small, defiant smile on his lips. He walked over, bypassing the towering gifts, and picked up her small, comic-wrapped package. He sat back down, carefully peeling back the worn newspaper comics. Beneath them, nestled simply, was an intricately carved wooden box, small and smooth with age, its dark wood worn soft in places. "It's beautiful, Grandma," Ethan said, tracing the delicate patterns with his finger, his voice genuine and appreciative. Eleanor felt a surge of warmth, a quiet vindication. "It's not just a box, Ethan," she explained, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "It's our family's story, our real story." Brenda, seeing where this was going, started to rise, a flicker of panic in her eyes. But it was too late. With a look of pure curiosity, Ethan lifted the lid. As he did, a single yellowed photograph, fragile with age, slipped out onto the white tablecloth. Ethan, his brow furrowed in curiosity, picked up the yellowed photograph that had slipped from the wooden box. He held it carefully, his thumb tracing the faded image. It depicted a much younger David, his face etched with a raw, desperate anxiety showing Eleanor remembered all too well. In the background, partially obscured but still visible, lay official-looking documents, one clearly marked "Final Notice." Ethan's gaze flickered between the photo and his father, then back to the image. "Is that Dad?" he asked, his voice laced with a confusion that cut through the lingering tension in the dining room. Brenda, who had been stiffening in her seat, lunged forward with surprising speed. "It's nothing, Ethan. Just an old picture." "Give it to me," she snapped, her hand outstretched, attempting to snatch the photograph. But Ethan, quick and agile, pulled it back, his grip firm. "No, Mom, what is it?" he insisted, his eyes now fixed on Eleanor. Eleanor, ignoring Brenda's frantic attempts, looked directly at David, her voice calm but resonant. "David," she said, her tone steady, "don't you think it's time he knew the truth?" David's face, already pale from the earlier exchange, drained of all color, his eyes wide with a mixture of dread and resignation. He stammered, his gaze darting between his mother and his son. "Mom, please. We should discuss this later. It's Ethan's birthday." His voice was weak, devoid of conviction. Eleanor met his pleading eyes, a lifetime of unspoken hurt bubbling to the surface. "Later? No, David. I'm done waiting, done being the scapegoat." Her voice hardened slightly, carrying an authority that silenced even Brenda. She turned her full attention back to Ethan, her eyes softening. "Ethan," she said, holding his gaze, "that box contains our family history. The real history, not the version you've been told." The atmosphere, already strained, now crackled with an undeniable sense of impending drama. Guests, sensing a deeply personal and potentially explosive confrontation, began to awkwardly make their excuses. A few mumbled about early mornings, others about unexpected phone calls. The polite goodbyes were hurried, their eyes lingering on the trio at the table, a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Soon only David, Brenda, Ethan, and Eleanor remained, the elaborate decorations suddenly feeling garish and out of place. Brenda, ever the performer, tried one last desperate attempt to regain control. "This is just Eleanor creating drama as usual, Ethan. You know how she is. Don't listen to her old stories." Her voice was high-pitched, a desperate edge creeping in. But Ethan wasn't buying it. He looked from his mother to his father, then to the photograph in his hand. "No, Mom," he said, his voice firm. "I want to know what this is about. What's the real story, Grandma?" His directness, his genuine desire for truth, gave Eleanor the courage she needed. Eleanor took a deep, fortifying breath, her mind already transporting her back 3 decades. The grand dining room, Brenda's desperate pleas, David's silent anguish, all faded. She was back in 1990, a year that had scarred her deeply. "It was 1990, she began, her voice gaining a quiet power. "Your father, David, was 28 years old, just starting out. He had big dreams, just like you, Ethan." She paused, a bittersweet smile playing on her lips. He'd started a small business, full of youthful optimism, but things hadn't gone to plan. She recounted the slow, agonizing decline of David's venture, how he had taken out loans, small at first, then larger, from increasingly dangerous people, a euphemism for loan sharks who preyed on desperate young entrepreneurs. Ethan's eyes, usually so full of youthful nonchalance, widened, captivated. This was a side of his successful, composed father he had never imagined. Eleanor continued, her voice steady. "Your father, the successful man you know today, found himself in a terrifying situation. He owed a staggering sum, $175,000. Brenda slammed her hand on the table, making the silverware rattle. "Eleanor, this is ancient history. It has nothing to do with anything," she hissed, her face contorted with fury. But Eleanor didn't even glance at her gaze was fixed on Ethan, telling him their story. "I was a widow then," Eleanor continued as if Brenda hadn't spoken, "living on a small pension from your grandfather's railroad job and a modest salary from my part-time bookkeeping work. I certainly didn't have that kind of money just lying around." She paused, the weight of the memory pressing down on her. "But I did have one asset." Her voice grew softer, tinged with a familiar sorrow. "Our family home." Ethan looked at her, then at the silent David, a dawning horror in his eyes. Eleanor took another breath, forcing the words out. "I sold my home, Ethan. The only home I'd ever owned. The one where your father grew up, where your grandfather and I built our life together." The confession, though 30 years old, still brought a fresh wave of pain. "I gave David every penny from the sale. It was enough to pay off his debts to those men, enough to give him a clean slate, to restart his life and business without fear." Ethan's gaze snapped to his father. "Grandma, you sold your house to save Dad?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, filled with disbelief and a nascent understanding. David, unable to speak, simply nodded, his eyes cast down, unable to meet his son's searching gaze. Eleanor gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug as if it had been nothing. "After that, I rented a small apartment, just a couple of rooms. It was fine. Family comes first, Ethan. Always." The silence that followed Eleanor's confession about selling her home was heavy, filled with the unspoken shock radiating from Ethan. He looked at his father, then back at Eleanor, his mind clearly racing to reconcile this new information with the narrative he had always known. Then, his next question, delivered in a quiet, almost hesitant voice, hung in the air like a condemned man's last breath. "And did Dad pay you back, Grandma, when his business finally took off, I mean?" David, who had remained stoically silent, finally lifted his head, his face a mixture of shame and resentment. It wasn't that simple, Ethan," he mumbled, his voice tight. "The business struggled for years afterward. It took a long time to get on its feet, and then, well, things just got complicated." His gaze flickered towards Brenda, as if seeking an unspoken cue. Ethan turned to David, his expression shifting from confusion to a deep, visible disappointment. But you told me, Dad. You always told me you built this entire empire from nothing. You said you pulled yourself up by your bootstraps, that you never took handouts. You even said Grandma tried to hold you back, that she didn't believe in you. His voice wavered, the raw hurt evident. The father he admired, the self-made man he aspired to be, was crumbling before his eyes. Eleanor reached across the table, gently placing her hand on Ethan's arm. Her voice was soft, compassionate, yet laced with a deep understanding of human frailty. That's what he started telling himself, Ethan, she explained, her eyes on David, who refused to meet her gaze. It's easier than living with the guilt of taking everything from your own mother. Easier than admitting you wouldn't be where you are without her sacrifice. Brenda, who had been simmering in furious silence, suddenly stood up, her chair scraping loudly across the polished floor, the sound harsh in the quiet room. Her face was flushed, her eyes blazing with indignation. This is exactly why we keep you at a distance, Eleanor, she shrieked, pointing an accusing finger. You twist everything. You always make yourself the martyr, the long-suffering saint, just to make David feel bad. You're manipulative. Eleanor met Brenda's outburst with a calm, unwavering gaze. The proof, Brenda, is in that box, she countered, her voice steady and deliberate. The deed of sale for my house. The bank transfer records showing every penny went directly into David's account. And if you look closely, you'll also find a few letters. Letters I wrote to David years later when I was truly struggling. Letters asking for just a small portion back. Not as a debt, but as a loan to help me with an unexpected expense. Letters that, I might add, went unanswered. Brenda scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. That money was a gift, Eleanor. David told me himself. A gift from a loving mother. But then you held it over his head for years, trying to control him, trying to control us. It was emotional blackmail. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly in genuine surprise. She turned to David, her voice hushed. Is that what you told her, David? That I used my sacrifice to control you? David finally looked up, his face grim. His voice was tight, strained. I was there, Mom. You never let me forget what you did. Every holiday, every phone call, it was always about what you gave up, what I owed you. Eleanor sat back, stunned, the air knocked out of her. A wave of profound sadness washed over her. Had his guilt twisted his memories so thoroughly? Had her pain, her silent suffering, somehow been transmuted into a weapon in his mind? It was an unbearable thought. David, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I never once asked for the full amount back, not a penny of the principal. And I only came to you 3 times in 30 years when I was truly desperate. When I needed surgery I couldn't afford. When the roof of my tiny apartment building collapsed. When I faced eviction because my landlord increased the rent beyond my means. Those were the only times. Ethan, completely engrossed, had begun pulling out the various old documents, letters, and faded photographs from the wooden box. The delicate papers rustled softly as he sifted through them. There's so much here, he murmured, his fingers brushing over the tangible evidence of a past carefully hidden. He unearthed a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with age, its cover embossed with a single initial, E.E. What's this? He asked, holding it up, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Eleanor's heart stopped. Her diary, the private repository of her most raw, unfiltered thoughts from those harrowing years. The one place where the truth, unvarnished and undeniable, had been meticulously recorded. Before she could utter a word of protest or explanation, Ethan, with the innocent disregard of youth, opened the small book. And now, as Ethan began to read a passage aloud, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of the words, the truth I had carried alone for 3 decades was finally being heard. Not just by David and Brenda, but by the grandson I had fought so hard to protect. He began to read from an entry dated shortly after the house sale in 1993, his voice gaining strength as he absorbed the words. Brenda asked me today, quite pointedly, if David was ever going to repay me for the house. I assured her, as I've assured David, that it was a gift, no strings attached. But the way she looked at me, the way David avoided my eyes, I wonder if he truly believes it himself, or if it's already begun to fester, to become something ugly in his mind. Ethan, his voice steady now, but laced with an undeniable tremor, continued to read from Eleanor's diary. He flipped to an entry from 1919. David and Brenda announced their engagement today. David seems happy, though a little distant, with me. Brenda made a pointed remark about me checking on my investment when I congratulated them. It felt cold, like a veiled accusation. I worry this distance will only grow after they're married. Brenda's face, already flushed, turned stony, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. These are private thoughts from decades ago, Ethan, she interjected, her voice sharp. They're Eleanor's interpretations, her biased view. They prove nothing. Let him finish, David said, his voice surprisingly firm, cutting Brenda off. His eyes, fixed on the old leather-bound diary in Ethan's hands, held a newfound intensity, a flicker of something akin to regret. Ethan, encouraged by his father's unexpected intervention, turned another page. This entry was from 1994, describing the day of David and Brenda's wedding. I spent most of the reception feeling like an outsider, seated at a table far from the bridal party, away from David, away from the rest of the immediate family. I saw the seating chart, Brenda's elegant handwriting. It felt intentional, as if I was being relegated to a distant acquaintance, not the mother of the groom. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment, the memory still vivid, the sting of exclusion as sharp as it had been that day. She recalled seeing the ornate seating chart, meticulously planned, each name assigned with a deliberate purpose. Her name, Eleanor Vance, stood out at the table furthest from the head, near the kitchen entrance. It had been more than an oversight, it was a carefully orchestrated humiliation. A few remaining guests who had lingered out of morbid curiosity shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Brenda, sensing their discomfort, slammed her hand on the table again, though less forcefully this time. "Don't you dare leave," as she commanded, her voice regaining some of its former authority, though it cracked slightly. "Stay. I want witnesses to this pathetic performance. Let her wallow in her self-pity for all to see." Ethan, ignoring his mother, continued to read, his voice becoming a conduit for Eleanor's unspoken pain. He found an entry from 1997. David called today. Brenda is expecting. My heart soared with joy for them, for a grandchild. But when I asked for pictures of the ultrasound, of Brenda's growing bump, they politely declined. Said it was too early. But I know it's Brenda. She wants to keep me out, even from this joyous event. I fear I won't truly be a grandmother to this child. Eleanor remembered the tiny, soft baby blanket she'd knitted, countless hours of loving stitches, meant for Ethan. She'd mailed it, wrapped with a hopeful note, but they had never acknowledged receiving it. Ethan turned a page. The date was 98, the year of his birth. The hospital called. Brenda's in labor. I rushed there, my heart pounding. But David met me at the door. "Only immediate family allowed, Mom," he said, his eyes avoiding mine. Brenda's rules. I watched from the waiting room alone for hours. A kind nurse, seeing my anguish, eventually snuck me in for 5 precious minutes. 5 minutes, Ethan, to hold my newborn grandson. 5 minutes before David ushered me out. Ethan looked up from the diary, his eyes wide and shocked. The revelation hit him hard. "They kept you from seeing me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "When I was born." He looked from Eleanor to David, then to Brenda, searching for answers, for denial. Neither David nor Brenda spoke, their silence a damning confirmation. David's head was bowed, his shoulders slumped. Brenda, however, remained defiant, though a flicker of fear danced in her eyes. Ethan's fingers flew through the pages, finding another entry, this one from 2003. "It's Ethan's 5th birthday. I wasn't invited. Brenda said they were keeping it small, just close friends. I baked his favorite chocolate cake and dropped it off at the door, hoping for a glimpse of him." Brenda opened it, her smile thin. "Oh, Eleanor, you just missed us. We're leaving for the park now." But I could hear the laughter and children's voices from inside. She lied. She wanted to hurt me, to exclude me from his life. The diary entries continued, a meticulous, heartbreaking chronicle of Brenda's deliberate exclusion tactics, her subtle and not-so-subtle manipulation of David, slowly turning him against his own mother. Each entry painted a picture of a woman fighting against an invisible wall, desperate to maintain a connection that was systematically being severed. Eleanor's words, raw and honest, laid bare the emotional abuse she had endured for decades. Ethan looked up, his gaze sweeping over his parents, his voice filled with a profound sense of betrayal. All these years, he said, his voice quiet but sharp, you've told me Grandma was the one who pulled away, that she was resentful, difficult, always causing problems. You painted her as the villain in our family story. Brenda, sensing the tide turning, tried one last desperate maneuver. She's showing you selected diary entries, Ethan. Of course she's going to paint herself as the victim. She's trying to manipulate you, just like she always tries to manipulate David. But Ethan was no longer listening to her. His hand dipped back into the wooden box. He pulled out a thick stack of envelopes, it tied neatly with a faded ribbon. What about these then? He asked, his voice laced with confusion. He fanned them out, revealing dozens of carefully preserved cards. Birthday cards, Christmas cards, from Grandma, to me, year after year. I've never seen these before. Contradiction to his parents' narrative. Brenda, however, remained unyielding, her defensiveness only hardening. We were protecting you, Ethan, she exclaimed, her voice shrill. Eleanor was always trying to buy your affection, trying to undermine us. She thought that by showering you with gifts and cards, she could turn you against us. Eleanor finally spoke again, her voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight of truth. She looked at Brenda, her eyes filled with a lifetime of unacknowledged sacrifice. Buying affection? With what, Brenda? With what money? Handmade gifts? Cards filled with love? The meager pension I lived on after giving every penny I had to save your husband? Her words hung in the air, piercing the veil of Brenda's carefully constructed lies. After giving everything, she repeated, the emphasis subtle but powerful. David, who had been staring at the table, finally lifted his head. For the first time in what felt like decades, he looked directly at his mother, a flicker of something raw and troubled in his eyes. Mom, he asked quietly, his voice raspy, if what you're saying is true, why didn't you speak up before now? Why all these years? Did you just let me believe otherwise? Eleanor sighed, a deep, weary sound that spoke of years of unspoken burdens. Because I thought it would push you further away, David, she explained, her voice softening, tinged with a mother's endless love and regret. Because I always hoped, always believed, that one day you would remember, on your own. And, she added, her gaze falling on Ethan, because I was protecting you. Protecting me from what? David pressed, his confusion evident. Eleanor met his gaze, unflinching. Protecting you from the full truth, David, from how deep your troubles truly were back then, from having to face the full extent of what you did and what it nearly cost you. Ethan, disturbed by the new darker undertones of the conversation, continued to sift through the contents of the wooden box. His fingers brushed against a folded, brittle piece of newsprint. He pulled it out, unfolded it carefully, and began to read the headline aloud, his voice low with disbelief. Local businessman narrowly escapes charges in investment scandal. He scanned the accompanying text, then looked up, his eyes wide with dawning horror. Dad, he asked, his voice barely a whisper, Is this about you? David's face, already pale, turned ashen. Brenda, seeing the article, lunged forward with a desperate cry. Give that to me, Ethan. It's irrelevant. But Ethan, his instincts now fully engaged, pulled the paper away, holding it out of her reach. The part you always left out, David, Eleanor said, her voice cutting through Brenda's protests, directly addressing her son. The real reason those loans were so dangerous. It wasn't just money you owed, was it, David? The room fell into an echoing silence. David's hands, resting on the table, began to tremble visibly. He swallowed hard, his throat working. It was complicated, Mom, he stammered, his voice hoarse. I was young, desperate to succeed. I made some mistakes. Eleanor finished the sentence for him, her voice unwavering, relaying a truth he had buried for decades. You made promises to investors that you couldn't keep. You diverted funds from one project to another, hoping to stave off collapse. You were facing serious charges, David, charges that could have ended in jail time, not just financial ruin. Ethan's eyes raced across the newspaper article, searching for more details. He found a crucial line and read it aloud, his voice sharp with a sudden new understanding. Charges were abruptly dropped due to lack of sufficient evidence. He looked up, his gaze intense, piercing through his father's evasion. What really happened, Dad? Why were the charges dropped? Eleanor looked at David, urging him with her eyes. Tell him, David, tell him why those charges just disappeared. David stared at the table, unable to meet his son's questioning gaze. He took a shuddering breath, then finally spoke, his voice barely audible. Mom used her connections. Eleanor nodded, filling into the blanks. My brother, your Uncle George, David, he was a judge, a respected man in the legal community. She paused, a profound sadness settling over her features. I went to him. I biggied him. I called in every favor, every personal connection he had, to make sure those charges wouldn't stick. That's illegal, Ethan whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The righteous, self-made image of his father was shattering piece by piece. Eleanor looked at her grandson, a tear finally tracing a path down her weathered cheek. Yes, Ethan, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. It was. Your Uncle George. He risked his entire career, his reputation, everything he had worked for, to do it. Ethan stared at Eleanor, then at his father, his face a mixture of awe and horror. His voice was tinged with a raw, complex emotion. You did all that? You sold your house. You compromised your own brother's ethics. You put his career on the line, all to save Dad? Ethan's voice, tinged with a complex mix of awe and horror, still hung in the air. You did all that. You sold your house. You compromised your own brother's ethics. You put his career on the line, all to save Dad? Eleanor simply looked at her grandson, a gentle, unwavering love in her eyes. He was my son, Ethan. I would have done anything for him. The simple statement, devoid of self-pity or accusation, was a profound truth. David's face, etched with decades of denial, finally crumpled. The weight of his mother's unconditional sacrifice, coupled with the revelation of his own self-deception, was too much to bear. I convinced myself, Mom, David stammered, his voice choked with emotion. I convinced myself that you helped because you wanted to control me, to make me indebted to you, Mom. Eleanor nodded sadly. The only string attached, David, she replied, her voice soft, was that I wanted to remain in your life, in Ethan's life. Brenda, who had been listening in a stunned, furious silence, finally found her voice. She stood abruptly, glaring at Eleanor. Why now, Eleanor? After all these years, why did you decide to do this now, on Ethan's birthday of all days? Her accusation was sharp, but it lacked its usual venom. Eleanor met her gaze, her expression resolute. Because it's time for the truth, Brenda. It's past time. Ethan deserves to know his family's real story, not the edited version you have created. Ethan, surprising everyone, stood up, pushing his chair back. His gaze swept over his parents, then rested on Eleanor. Everything Grandma did was for her family, he declared, his voice firm, a newfound conviction in his tone. What you did, Mom and Dad, was build a wall to keep her out. He turned to Eleanor, his brow furrowed with a lingering question. Why didn't you fight harder, Grandma? Why didn't you tell us sooner? Eleanor sighed, a deep, weary breath. I thought it was temporary, Ethan. I always hoped you would come around. And honestly, I was afraid. Afraid that if I pushed too hard, if I revealed everything, I would lose even the small, fragile connection I had left with you both. I couldn't bear that. Ethan, still holding the wooden box, dipped his hand inside again. He pulled out a small, velvet pouch. Inside, he found a set of keys and a folded document. What's this, Grandma? He asked, his voice curious. Those are the keys to my apartment building, Eleanor explained, a faint smile playing on her lips. After I sold the house, I didn't just rent that small apartment, Ethan. I worked 3 jobs, saved every penny from my pension, and eventually bought it. It's an investment property now. Ethan then pulled out a folded bank statement. His eyes scanned the figures and his jaw slowly dropped. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice incredulous. This is over $100,000. He looked at the accompanying document. "It's a trust fund. For me. Maturing on my 18th birthday." In a moment that surprised everyone, Ethan did the unexpected. He picked up the wooden box, which now felt less like a relic and more like a treasure's chest of truth, and moved to sit beside Eleanor, gently placing it between them. He turned to her, his young face earnest and full of reverence. "I want to hear more, Grandma," he stated quietly, his voice full of newfound respect. "I want to know everything." David watched, a stricken expression on his face, the full weight of his actions finally settling upon him. After a long, pregnant silence, David slowly stood up from his seat at the far end of the table. He walked around, his steps heavy, and moved to Eleanor's other side, sitting down beside her. He looked at Ethan, then at his mother. "You're right, Ethan," he said, his voice raw. "And I need to hear the truth too. All of it." He turned to Eleanor, his eyes brimming with tears, a lifetime of suppressed guilt and shame finally breaking through. "I'm sorry, Mom," he choked out, his voice cracking. "I am so sorry." Brenda, left alone at the other end of the table, watched her family reconcile without her. "So that's it, David?" she spat, her voice laced with bitterness. "You're just going to choose her side? After everything?" Ethan, now emboldened, reached into the box one last time. He pulled out a worn, slightly flattened teddy bear. "Mr. Beans," he whispered, his eyes wide. It was David's childhood comfort toy, a relic from a time before bitterness. Eleanor reached out, her fingers gently touching the bear. "Of course I did, Ethan," she confirmed, a soft smile on her face. "I've kept everything that mattered." Eleanor then looked at Brenda, her gaze calm and steady, devoid of anger, filled instead with a quiet dignity. "Brenda," she said, her voice clear, "I didn't come here today to destroy your family. I came to reclaim my place in it, not to take yours." David, looking at Brenda, finally stood by his mother. "Mom isn't a threat, Brenda," he said, his voice firm, a newfound backbone in his posture. "She never was." Brenda, her defiance crumbling, looked away. I was scared, David," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "Scared of being human, flawed, like all of us." Ethan, with his newfound resolve, turned to Eleanor. "I want to know my grandmother," he said, his voice brimming with genuine emotion. "Really know her." David, in an effort to show his commitment, placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I'll match your gift, Mom," he offered, his eyes on Ethan. "Every penny." Ethan reached into the box once more, finding a small silver locket. He opened it, revealing two tiny faded baby photos, one of a newborn David and the other of himself, a baby in Eleanor's arms. Eleanor took it, her fingers tracing the images. She fastened the locket around her neck. "No more hiding," she declared, a quiet strength in her voice. David then looked at Eleanor, tears still in his eyes, but a hopeful smile starting to form. "Mom," he asked, his voice soft, would you stay here tonight, just family?" Eleanor smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that erased 30 years of pain. "I'd like that, David," she said. "It was a beginning to healing, to truth, and to the family they were meant to be."